A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulihil kareem. Brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today we come face to face with perhaps the greatest evil that stalks the modern world. The monster that is nationalism needs detailed description and analysis. Nationalism is a force for the disintegration of the human personality and society at all levels. My views on the subject are well known. My first paper on the subject, called Beyond the Muslim Nation States, was written nearly 10 years ago. The roots of nationalism in history and its impact on the Ummah are examined in detail in the papers written for this seminar. My purpose is to take a pragmatic, empirical view of the state of the Ummah under the impact of nationalism. Nationalism is also the root of such other common evils as national socialism, national capitalism, national democracy, and national culture. We are dealing with a disease that affects a wide variety of human behavior. Nationalism has tried to capture the entire human personality at all levels, body, mind, and soul. However, the poison of nationalism has been injected and continues to be injected and spread through one and only one source, and that source is the control and manipulation of political power. The point that has to be clearly understood is that the state is the ultimate source of all good or evil in any society. It is almost impossible to be a Muslim without either living in an Islamic state or being engaged in a struggle to establish an Islamic state. The end product of the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the Islamic state of Medina. The Islamic state is an essential and integral part of Islam. Indeed, Islam is incomplete without the Islamic state. The Islamic state is Allah's own chosen framework in which the moral, political, social, economic, and cultural goals of Islam are pursued by the entire Muslim Ummah. All this is common ground among Muslims. There is, however, a great deal of confusion about how the Islamic state is established. On the face of it, the answer to this question too should be simple and easily understood by all Muslims. The method of Allah's Messenger, upon whom be peace, ought to be as clear as the divine message. The confusion over the method of Islam for establishing the Islamic state is largely, though not entirely, due to the political dominance of the West over Muslim societies. Once under alien political control and tutelage, Muslim societies began to throw up intellectuals, philosophers, and political thinkers and activists and so-called leaders who also accepted the intellectual and cultural overlordship of the West. The West's colonial ambitions included the outright abolition and destruction of all institutions developed in traditional Muslim societies. The people of the colonies were offered so-called progress, opportunity, and participation in the new colonial order, if and only if they learned European languages, acquired Western education, and generally accepted the European outlook and way of life. The Europeanized classes were also encouraged to look forward to a day when the European colonial states would be handed over to them as independent states. But before the newly Europeanized colonials could be fit for political emancipation, they had to become nationalists. As nationalists, they were encouraged to mix a little Islam with their politics. Thus we came to acquire the so-called fathers of our so many nations. The independence they bequeathed to us was and remains to this day little more than a continuation of the European colonial states. These colonial states, now called nation states, are replete with national frontiers, national flags, national anthems, national days, national languages, and above all, national interests. No two nation states can have identical national interests. The impact of this on the Ummah has been devastating. The political map of the Ummah today represents the defeat and dismemberment of the political power of Islam. It also represents the continued political, economic, social, and cultural dominance of the West over the lands and peoples of Islam. The temporary loss of Palestine to Zionism was also made possible by the prior dismemberment of the heart of Islam into nation states. The greater tragedy of this period is that there also emerged a number of national Islamic parties. Nowhere in the world have such parties succeeded in attaining even modest goals within their chosen national political systems. Nowhere in the world has an Islamic political party succeeded in setting up anything that could even remotely be described as an Islamic state. In my view, the Islamic parties were and remain a peculiar product of the colonial period. What we must all recognize is that the founders of these Islamic parties were men of great learning, integrity, and taqwa. Some of the books written in this period have greatly enriched the literary heritage of Islam. But the learning, integrity, and taqwa of these great figures of recent Muslim history cannot be used to defend the record and political role of the parties they founded. The position that the Muslim Institute has taken for more than a decade is that no progress in rebuilding the house of Islam is possible in the framework of the post-colonial nation states. The path of the Ummah and of the Islamic movement within the Ummah is blocked by the nation states. The nation states are like huge boulders blown across our path by the ill wind of recent history. All nation states that today occupy, enslave, and exploit the lands, peoples, and the resources of the Ummah have to be dismantled, one and all. The idea of the state based on nationalism is so alien to the moral genius of our people that every single nation state in the Ummah is unstable, weak, and forever on the verge of collapse. It is only the regular injection of military and economic aid from the leading imperialist powers that keeps these states going. None of these states has solved any of its own problems or those of its people. While the dismantling of these nation states is unlikely to present many problems, a great many conceptual and organizational problems have to be overcome. These relate to the nature and organization of the Islamic movement, to the political map of the Ummah in the future, and to the political, economic, and social transformation of the Ummah that we now seek to bring about. Let us realize that the extent, depth, and nature of change that we now seek is the most profound transformation of a world community that has ever been attempted in all history. It is quite clear that one Ummah must mean one Islamic movement leading to one global Islamic state under one Imam Khalifa. From where we stand today, the prospect of a single global Islamic state under one leader seems so remote that most people would put such a goal beyond the bounds of realism. Before we can expect to be taken seriously, however, we must go further and insist that a rigorous system of thought based on observation and experimentation be put forward by the ulama and intellectuals of Islam for the total transformation of the Ummah. It is possible that the need for the total transformation of the Ummah has at no time before been as obvious and as urgently felt as it is today. In the period of rapid expansion of the domains of Islam and the political and cultural dominance that the Muslims enjoyed, the need for such a transformation was not felt. The rapid physical and political expansion was itself seen as transformation irrespective of its quality. For us, the Quran is a fathomless source of knowledge. Our understanding of the Quran will deepen with our own understanding of the processes of history, our experience, and our ability to absorb and use new knowledge. The Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is also a record of the total transformation of the Hijaz and its people over 23 years. From the Sunnah that transformed the Hijaz, we have to derive a program for the transformation of the Ummah that is now global. We must not underestimate the power of the nation states and their ruling classes to exploit the nationalist emotions of our people. The boulders of nationalism and the nation states are not lifeless, inanimate objects accidentally blown into the path of Islam. They represent the mobilized power of nifaq and also some well-meaning but misguided Islamic parties. These obstacles in the path of Islam are all armed and supported by the power of global kufr. They are going to fight Islam at every step, all the way. The forces inimical to Islam are so deeply rooted in the fabric of the Ummah that all conflicts will be simultaneously internal and external. Those within the Muslim societies who insist on accepting the political, social, cultural, and economic supremacy of the West are not only our rulers, countrymen, and neighbors, but often members of our own families. These conflicts will not leave any one of us unaffected. Those opposed to Islam have already declared war on Islam. And the greatest manifestation of this declaration of war against Islam is the era of nationalism and the nation states. There can be no compromise. There can be no accommodation. And there can be no peace in the world of Islam so long as any traces of nationalism and all its various political, social, cultural, and economic manifestations remain in our societies. The total transformation of the Ummah has never been stated as a set of achievable goals. Muslim political thought in the last 200 years has been entirely a reaction to the decline of Muslim political power. The West's scientific, technological, and economic achievements so dazzled Muslim thinkers that they accepted progress as defined by the West as essential for the future of Muslim society. It was this search for reconciliation between Islam and the Western-style progress that led to attempts to admit nationalism, capitalism, democracy, and lately socialism into Islam. How deeply ingrained this idea of the compatibility of Islam with the West is demonstrated by the support Islamic parties are giving to programs of so-called Islamization in Muslim nation states where rulers are both secular and subservient to the West. There are also some Islamicists who hold the view that the United States of America is a friend of Islam and a natural ally against godless communism. Let us first of all realize that we cannot even begin to think about the total transformation of the Ummah without first taking up the position that there is no compatibility whatsoever between Islam and the West. It is only when we have taken this step that we have created the necessary spiritual, material, and historical situation in which the total transformation of the Ummah becomes a logical necessity. In today's historical situation, the declaration of the incompatibility of the civilization of Islam with the civilization of the West is the only step that can free us from the psychological stranglehold in which the West has held us for so long. This declaration of incompatibility forces us to prove the point that we are in fact incompatible. It forces us to define our civilizational goals in terms of Islam and Islam alone. It demands that we find alternatives to such global sacred cows as capitalism, socialism, and democracy. It makes it necessary for us to find out our own solutions to the problems of underdevelopment, poverty, and wealth. The mobilized will of the Muslim masses under a muttaqi leadership makes the Islamic State an invincible force. Compare this with the modern nation states in which the people are divided by competing political parties and professional soldiers provide some of the most oppressive regimes of all history. In the nation states where the ruling classes and Islamic parties regard Islam as compatible with the West, the political systems are subservient to the West. The economies of these states are also integrated into the world capitalist system. The path of the Ummah is blocked not only by the boulders of nationalism, but also by the entire logjam of the Western civilization. The road to the total transformation of the Ummah is a long one. When we talk about the total transformation of the Ummah, we are talking about a process of history making that will occupy us for a very long time to come. However, the immediate change of direction that is required must, at the very minimum, include the emergence of a global Islamic movement that rejects nationalism and the nation states in their entirety and regards the West as totally incompatible with Islam. The declaration of the incompatibility of the West with Islam brings us face to face with another question to which I have often referred in the past. It is the question of leadership. Once we have taken up the position of incompatibility of Islam and the West, We have also taken the position that those educated in the Western tradition have no part to play in the leadership of the Islamic movement. Western education teaches a man to be arrogant and selfish. In all Muslim societies today, we have ruling classes who have been educated and trained to dominate and exploit our countries in the style of Western colonialists. The Western educated ruling classes of today are the children, grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren of those who welcomed the Western colonialists and cooperated with them. Throughout history, there is not a single instance of a Western educated Muslim elite that has served Islam in any meaningful way. There are, of course, hordes of Western educated scholars of Islam who have taken their degrees in Islam as others have taken degrees in medicine, law, economics, history, and so on. These are the scholars, so-called scholars of Islam, who have been trying to write books on Islamic economics, Islamic politics, Islamic liberalism, and so on. The leadership ranks of the Islamic parties are full of such Islamizers. In Iran, these people tried to re-establish Iran as a liberal and democratic nation state with a few cosmetic Islamic changes. But now that the nationalists, the liberals, communists, and the munafiqeen have been unmasked and defeated, the vast majority of the westernized elite's youth performs glorious deeds in the service of the Islamic revolution and the new Islamic state. The so-called leaders of our independence and the fathers of our nations have been some of the most slavish people the Ummah has ever produced. They and their successors have done the bidding of the West more than the bidding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the struggle against kufr that lies ahead. These men and their supporters are likely to play the political role of kufr and shirk against Islam. They will be the chief instruments of the West's war against Islam and the Islamic movement. It is not an accident that all the nation states dividing the Ummah today are lined up behind Saddam Hussein. Nor is it an accident that both superpowers are also on the same side. The incompatibility between Islam and the West that we have established, or at least I have tried to establish, and the total transformation of the Ummah that we seek to bring about, forces us to seek a leadership which is also compatible with our goals. Such a leadership can only emerge from the roots of Islam itself. If such people, let us call them ulama, do not already exist, then we will have to wait until they do. However, I do not accept that such ulama do not exist. Some such ulama, especially in British India in the last century and early part of this century, opposed the leadership of the secularized, westernized Muslims, but failed to offer an alternative to the dominance of kufr. The Muslim masses largely ignored them. The Muslim masses also ignored the Islamic alternative offered by the Islamic parties. Today, the historical situation has been transformed. On the one hand, the Muslim masses in one country, led by their ulama, have swept aside the power of kufr and established an Islamic state. On the other, the post-colonial regimes in the nation states have been unmasked and exposed as instruments of the political dominance of kufr. It is true that the subservient ulama and the Islamic parties are still trying to defend the status quo, but it is also true that large numbers of both ordinary and very influential people in the Ummah, including many ulama, have become convinced that the only way forward is through a succession of Islamic revolutions in all areas of the world. Thus, the new global Islamic movement represents a new confidence in the Ummah. The evidence of this spiritual and intellectual ferment in the Ummah is everywhere. This new mood in the Ummah cuts across all other known barriers of nationalism, ethnicity, territoriality, and sectarianism. This is especially so between Muslims following the Shi'i and Sunni schools of thought. Despite the efforts now being made by the enemies of Islam to divide the Shi'i and Sunni Muslims, the fact is that in the last 6 years, under the influence of the Islamic Revolution, more Shi'i and Sunni brothers have come closer together than at any time before. Everything about the new Islamic movement is in its infancy. An entirely new phase in the history of Islam has been inaugurated. The greatest assets of the new Islamic movement are the Islamic Revolution, the Islamic state that has been established in Iran, and the leadership of the ulama, and above all, the leadership of Imam Khomeini. We must note that if the new Islamic movement sets out to achieve the total transformation of the Ummah, then the quality of the leadership will be determined by the nature of the struggle that is undertaken. There is no doubt whatsoever in my mind that the total transformation of the Ummah will require a total struggle at all levels and in all fields of human activity. Our struggle will be spiritual, philosophical, political, social, cultural, economic, scientific, and military. Because we seek the total transformation of the global Ummah, the struggle will be conducted at all levels and at different levels in different parts of the world simultaneously. In some parts of the Ummah, as in Iran today, the struggle may have reached a relatively advanced stage. In other parts of the Ummah, the struggle has barely begun. The instrument for the total transformation of the Ummah can be none other than the global Islamic movement. The method of the Islamic movement is the seerah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. After a prolonged struggle, the speed of transformation is accelerated to a point at which it is referred to as an Islamic revolution. The Islamic revolution is that stage at which the Islamic movement converts a territory, a country, into an Islamic state. The Islamic state is then invaded by external enemies of Islam, and the internal enemies try to subvert it. This is straight from the seerah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. After a prolonged struggle, the Islamic state defeats its internal and external enemies and acquires control over its environment. The first stage is clearly the stage of prolonged struggle. In the seerah, this stage is known as the Meccan period. For most of us, this period of the Islamic movement is small and weak, and there is no reason to believe that such a fledgling band of believers can overcome the established and dominant order and civilization. The power and arrogance of the established order and the relative weakness of the Islamic movement do not persuade the Islamic movement to tone down its beliefs, ideas, methods, or goals. In the new Meccan period, in which the bulk of the Ummah lives today, the Islamic movement has to define its position clearly, crisply, and unambiguously. Our basic declaration of faith, there is no ilah except Allah, must be related to the contemporary objects of worship that we have acquired in recent history. In the Prophet's time, the declaration that there is no ilah was understood by the Quraysh of Mecca as referring to the hundreds of idols they kept in the Kaaba. The Meccans also understood clearly that the declarations of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam were a direct challenge to the established system of authority and hierarchy in Mecca at the time. The new global Islamic movement of today has to make equally forthright and unambiguous declarations. For instance, we have to state categorically that the only two collective identities we recognize are those of the House of Islam and the House of Kufr. The Muslims are one Ummah and the Kuffar are one Millat. There is no third Millah in the world, and the Muslim Ummah recognizes no nationality as a basis of law, statehood or sovereignty. There is no compatibility between the civilizations of Islam and the civilization of Kufr. Once such a declaration has been made, it also means that all the pillars of the Western civilization, such as social democracy, capitalism, socialism, liberalism, republicanism, Marxism, anarchism, populism, unionism, and so on and so forth, are all part and parcel of the millat of Kufr. All these ideas, beliefs and philosophies, often dressed up as science and progress, have been institutionalized, and the highest of these institutions is the nation state. All nation states of today, including those with predominantly Muslim populations, are therefore integral parts of the global domination that Kufr has acquired over Islam. No exception to this rule is possible. It must be argued, indeed it cannot be. It must not be argued, indeed it cannot be argued, that because there is shura in Islam, modern democracy is Islamic. That because private property is allowed in Islam, modern capitalism is Islamic. That because Islam believes in equality, there is socialism in Islam, and so on and so forth. We have to wipe the slate clean before we can write on it. We have to demolish what exists before we can build on the site. This is the meaning of the declaration that there is no ilah except Allah. It is this single, bold, definitive, uncompromising step taken in Mecca that ultimately led to the total transformation of the Hijaz. And it is this single step, when it is taken by the global Islamic movement today, that will inexorably lead to the total transformation of the Ummah. There is one more condition that has to be met. The global Islamic movement cannot take the first step without a leader. This condition has not been met in the days of the local, regional and national Islamic parties or partial Islamic movements. In Iran, the transition from the Meccan period to the Islamic state has been achieved under the muttaqi leadership of the ulama of Iran. One of them is now their imam. There is no other holder of political office in the world of Islam today, no other living soul who can possibly qualify for the leadership of the global Islamic movement. Another point of vital importance is that in the original Meccan period, the Muslim Ummah was not only small but also united. There were no schools of thought in Islam then. Such differences that exist among Muslims today are a peculiar product of the course that the history of Islam has taken. My view is that because our history has been divisive, we are divided. Once the course of our history turns towards the pursuit and achievement of the goals of Islam that are common to Muslims of all schools of thought, history itself will make these divisions a distant memory. The same sentiment was echoed by none other than Imam Khomeini in a message to the Hujjaj in September 1980. He said, and I quote, "To love one's fatherland and its people and to protect its frontiers are both quite unobjectionable, but nationalism involving hostility to other Muslim nations is something quite different. It is contrary to the Quran and to the orders of the Prophet. Nationalism that results in the creation of enmity between Muslims and splits the ranks of the believers is against Islam and the interest of the Muslims. More saddening and dangerous than nationalism is the creation of dissension between Sunnis and Shiis and diffusion of mischievous propaganda among brother Muslims." This is a very long passage from which I will read just one more small part. I quote again, "The most important and painful problem confronting the subjugated nations of the world, both Muslim and non-Muslim, is the problem of America. In order to swallow up the material resources of the countries it has succeeded in dominating, America, the most powerful country in the world, will spare no effort. However, we should acknowledge that there are major obstructions to the expression of this unity in the Ummah. The political, economic, social and cultural obstructions to the expression of the unity of the Ummah are enormous. The greatest of these obstructions is nationalism and the nation states. The major objective of the Islamic movement is to realize and mobilize the masses under muttaqi leaders in all parts of the world. As this goal is achieved, new Islamic states will be established until one day, inshallah, the entire Ummah will consist of Islamic states that are united in a hierarchy of institutions under a single leader. Clearly, the new leadership of the Ummah, as it takes shape, will have to engage in a prolonged process of ijtihad to remove the many new issues that will undoubtedly arise, to resolve the many new issues that will undoubtedly arise. The Seerah is clearly the blueprint for the Islamic movement at all its stages. The Seerah literature that is found today is almost entirely devoted to the recording of events. There is as yet little or no attempt to derive from the Seerah a program for the total transformation of the Ummah in today's conditions. The new global Islamic movement will motivate a new generation of ulama. Ijtihad will henceforth be a continuous, dynamic process prompted and guided by issues that will emerge in the course of the struggle that lies ahead. The Islamic movement recognizes no frontiers in the Ummah. The struggle for the liberation of any one part of the Ummah can be carried out from any other part of the Ummah. Every part of the Ummah is a potential asset for all other parts of the Ummah. This means that every obstacle in the path of the Islamic movement in one part of the Ummah is also an obstacle for the entire Islamic movement. Every Muslim engaged in this struggle in any part of the world, however remote or isolated, is engaged in a global struggle. Every group that is engaged in the struggle, however small or remote, is also part of the global struggle of the Islamic movement against kufr. Finally, we have to eradicate all traces of nationalism from the Islamic movement before we can challenge and defeat the power of nationalism established in territorial national states and a worldview and a worldwide international system dominated by the mobilized power and resources of the enemies of Islam. Ultimately, the shape of the Ummah will be determined by the shape taken by the Islamic movement today. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.